Hi, welcome. My name's Madge, I'm the Operations Manager here at New Horizons in Birmingham. The video you're about to watch is one of our trainers, Harpreet Gill, undertaking the dismantling and putting together a PC for the purposes of a tutorial. Enjoy.
As you can see here, the PC is fully working. I will now switch it off. You will need an ESD mat, a mouse, keyboard, monitor and workstation setup. Here you can see my workstation has been set up and is fully working. This is called a ESD wrist strap, which is an anti-static. You will need to put this around your wrist and then connect the crocodile clip to the chassis of your PC. This will then help you ground yourself from the PC. So you can use the anti-static wrist strap, which will provide good anti-static properties against electrostatic discharge. For more advanced users, you can use the ESD mat with the strap attached with the crocodile clip. That will then be connected to something that is grounded. First, we will make sure we disconnect the power supply and all the wires. This will include all the USB wires and the VGA cable as well. I will now safely place the monitor out of the way along with the keyboard and the mouse. I will now continue to open up the case of the PC. With this Dell PC, there is an opening catch to release the side of the PC. This is the view inside of the PC. You can see the power supply unit, the motherboard, CPU, fan shroud and optical disk drives, along with all the wires as well. I will continue to connect the ESD mat strap to the chassis of the PC to ground any components that are placed onto it. I will now take the wrist strap and place it around my wrist and place it to the chassis of the PC. I am first going to take out the hard drive out of the PC. So I will first disconnect the SATA power cable from the hard drive. This will then be continued to disconnect the SATA data cables from the hard drive. I can now slot out the hard drive out of the hard drive bay and also place it onto the ESD mat. I will also disconnect the SATA data cable from the motherboard and also place it on the mat as well. Here is the hard drive. I will now disconnect the optical disk drive from the computer by first taking out the data cable from the motherboard and disconnecting the data cable from the back of the optical disk drive. I will now place the cable on the ESD mat. I will now disconnect the Molex power connector from the back of the optical disk drive. I will also take out the fascia at the front of the PC for easy access to the optical disk drive. I will now continue to take out the optical disk drive out of the bay and also place this on the actual ESD mat. I have now successfully taken out the optical disk drive out of the PC. I will now disconnect the floppy disk drive out of the computer by first taking out the Molex power cable. I will then disconnect the ribbon cable from the motherboard, which provides the data, and also take it out of the floppy drive itself. Just be careful any wires that are maybe attached to the case. I will then continue to take this out and place the cable onto the ESD mat. I will now take out the floppy drive out of the drive bay. Just be careful, sometimes these are screwed in, which you might need a cross Phillips screwdriver to take out. I will now place this on the ESD mat. I've now successfully taken out all three optical drives out of the computer. I will now take out the 20-pin ATX power cable from the motherboard, which is connected to the power supply unit. I will continue to take out the screws out the back of the power supply unit, ready for me to take out the actual power supply unit itself. This is a crosshead screwdriver. I'm now going to take the power supply unit out. Be careful to untangle any wires that might be connected to it. I'll also take out the power supply unit now and place this onto the ESD mat. Make sure all the power cables have been disconnected successfully. On the power supply unit itself, we have a 20-pin motherboard power connector known as P1. We also have a mini Molex, which is normally connected to the floppy drive. We also have a standard Molex connector, which is used to connect to hard drives and optical drives known as IDE drives. The cable itself has 4 wires, 2 of which provide the volts, and 2 black wires which are grounded wires. We also have a 4-pin power connector, which is used to connect to the CPU to give it additional power. And finally, we have a SATA power cable to power SATA devices such as hard drives and optical disk drives. Here, I will disconnect the USB header from the front of the PC. I will continue to take off the CPU fan and shroud by first unscrewing all the screws. Make sure you do use the right screwdriver, depending on the manufacturer. I will now separate the heatsink from the CPU. As you can see here, here's the actual heatsink itself, which I'll place on the ESD mat. I will now disconnect the CPU fan power connector from the motherboard. I have now disconnected all the devices from the motherboard, so it's now easy to take it out. I will now continue to take out all the screws out of the motherboard. Just make sure that all the screws are taken out from the mounting points on the actual motherboard itself. Be careful not to apply too much pressure when taking out the screws from the motherboard, as you do want to prevent any damage from occurring. Now that I've taken out all the screws, I will now take out the motherboard and place it gently on the ESD mat. Here you can see the empty case of the computer with the motherboard out, and all the devices have been taken out as well. I will leave the fan in there for now. Here is a picture before we took out the motherboard or any of the devices, and here's a picture of all the devices now taken out. Here we see the motherboard itself. As you can see, it does look like a city from above with various components, chips, CPUs and heat sinks. Here we see a CPU socket, IDE hard drive connectors, PCI expansion slots, North Bridge and South Bridge, and various heat sinks. And here is the RAM. I will now take out the RAM by clicking on the 2 clips on the side. Make sure you do handle the RAM carefully by holding it by the edge. On the processor, we have thermal paste. This keeps the CPU cool. To take out the CPU, we need to lift up the ZIF arm, which stands for Zero Insertion Force, whereby we can now lift up the lever, and we'll take out the actual cover and take out the actual processor itself. So here I'm taking out the brain of the computer, which is known as CPU, and gently placing it onto the ESD mat. This is known as a CMOS battery, which is used to power the CMOS. So first, on the motherboard, we have a power socket known as the 20-pin power connector for this motherboard. This will actually provide power to all the components on the actual motherboard. This is a 4-pin power connector used to give additional power to the CPU. These are the memory slots where you insert the RAM chips. There are clips on the side to take out the RAM chips and secure them into place. This is a floppy ID 34-pin connector, and this is the 40-pin connector, which is used for the older ID hard drives and optical disk drives. You can see here there is a notch in the middle of the actual socket itself to stop it being inserted in the wrong way round. To connect expansion cards, you can see that we have these PCI slots. They also have a notch in the slot itself to stop any cards being inserted the wrong way around. Here you can see a IDE data connector, and also a PC internal speaker. We also have a power connector for the PC case fans. Sometimes it's not easy to see what the connector actually does. If you look closely at the markings on the motherboard or the documentation, you will have clues. Here we see various electronic components on the motherboard, including capacitors, resistors, and oscillators. Here we can see the SATA port for data transfer and also the CPU fan connector. These are the various input-output ports at the back of the PC, such as USB, VGA, serial cable, audio, and network ports. This is a CPU heatsink. As you can see here, it contains a lot of fins, whereby the cool air passes through these fins and cools down the CPU by increasing its surface area. Here, I will just demonstrate how to install a hard drive in the computer in theory. So first you will need a SATA cable, and you will need a power supply cable coming from the power supply unit. I will first connect a SATA data cable into the back of the hard drive, and then connect the other side into the motherboard itself. I will then get the SATA power cable from the power supply unit and connect it to the back of the SATA hard drive. So this is your hard drive now connected up to the motherboard and to the power supply unit. Sometimes the thermal paste of the CPU can dry up, causing overheating. You will now need to apply some brand new thermal paste in the middle of the CPU if this happens. When you place it in the middle, the actual thermal paste will spread out when the heatsink is placed on top of it. Here I am applying a small amount of thermal paste in the middle of the CPU. I will now place the CPU back into the CPU socket and close the cover. I will also push down the ZIF arm. Make sure you hear a click, which means that the CPU is now in place securely. I will now place the heatsink and shroud on top of the CPU itself. Here I am installing memory RAM into the RAM slots. Make sure when you push it down, to connect it properly, you must push it into the socket and the clips will self-close. If not, you need to push it in yourself. Make sure they are clipped in both sides, otherwise errors can occur. I will now insert a PCI expansion card into the actual PCI slot. This is a network interface card. I will now demonstrate what happens when you install a brand new graphics card into an older motherboard. This graphic card comes inside of an ESD bag to protect it against ESD. I will now take it out and hold it carefully on the edges. As you can see here, the brand new graphics card will not fit into the old style PCI slots. This particular graphics card is a PCI Express card and will not fit inside of a PCI slot. I want to now reinstall the motherboard back into the case. When I do install it, I need to make sure the holes are aligned properly with the actual mounting points, and make sure the input-output interface ports at the back of the motherboard are aligned properly with the case, so can be inserted with the wires afterwards. Here you can see that the input-output interfaces are properly aligned, so make sure that the motherboard is aligned with the mounting points on the case. You can then now replace these screws back onto the motherboard. Again, make sure you do not apply too much pressure, otherwise you can damage the motherboard itself. We can now replace the heatsink back onto the CPU and connect it properly. We will then continue to connect the optical data cable and the power supply unit. Make sure it is connected to the motherboard properly. We will now install the power supply unit back into the case. Make sure the screws are properly put back into the power supply unit. We can now replace the optical drive back into the 5.2-inch drive bay into the computer. Make sure it is fully inserted and make sure there's enough space at the back for the data and power cable. We can now also insert the floppy drive back into the computer, again making sure it is fully in and making sure there's enough space at the back for the data and power cables. I will now replace the fascia at the front of the PC. Make sure it snaps back into place properly. I will now replace the optical drive into the computer as well. So I'll get the Molex connector and put it at the back of the optical drive. This will provide it with its power. I will also get the data cable from the optical drive. Make sure it is connected at the back. This uses a 40-pin connector. I will also now connect the ribbon cable back into the motherboard itself. Make sure I put it into the right port and into the right way. Make sure it's clicked into place. I will also get the red stripe of the ribbon cable. That represents pin 1 to make sure it is placed into the right way. I can now replace the ribbon cable back into the motherboard. This one is for the floppy drive. That uses a 34-pin IDE connector. I will now take the mini Molex power supply and plug it in the back of the floppy drive. This is connected to the power supply unit. I will now reconnect the hard drive back into the computer by placing it into the slot itself. I will take the SATA power cable and connect it to the back of the hard drive. This will provide it with the power. I will also get the SATA data cable, connect it to the back of the hard drive, and connect this into the actual motherboard itself, making sure it is in the right port. I will now reconnect the power supply unit into the motherboard using this 20-pin ATX power connector. Sometimes you do need to provide additional power to the CPU. This is provided by this 4-pin power connector from the PSU into the motherboard. I've also here connected a CPU fan into the motherboard which will power the CPU fan. I will now demonstrate how to install a network interface card or expansion card into the computer. First, you need to take off the back plate out of the back of the PC. Sometimes these are screwed, or in this example they are clipped in. So I'll take one of the face plates out of the back. As you can see here now, there's a slot for your wire to connect to the back of the PC. This is a network interface card, which I will now plug into the PCI slot expansion card on the computer, which is what it's designed for. As you can see at the back now, you can see the RJ45 socket where I can put the wire in. I will now replace the case back onto the PC, make sure it clips into place. I can now finally take off the ESD wrist strap and the mat from the chassis of the PC and take the wrist strap off my wrist. I'm now going to take the VGA cable, which is used to connect the monitor to the PC. I can now reconnect the mouse and keyboard as well. So here I will connect the keyboard back into the USB slot at the back of the computer. I would also connect the mouse wire back into the back of the PC. And also the VGA cable into the monitor itself. This uses a 15-pin connector. Make sure it is securely put in there. I will now take the other end and plug it into the back of the actual PC itself, again in the VGA port. I will then connect the power cable back into the monitor. This uses a kettle lead, and the power cable at the back of the PC. This will provide it with a power. We are now ready to switch on the PC to make sure it is fully working. I will now switch on the power of the PC. Now check on the monitor to see if there are any error messages displayed. So we can see it's now loading up the operating system. We can see here now that there is an error message. You can try and press F1 to see if it skips the error. As you can see here, F1 hasn't worked, so we need to go into the BIOS by pressing the F2 key. Within the BIOS itself, you can see various options. You need to go through each option to check if there's any error message displayed. Here I can see that there's no hard drive detected, which means it might not be plugged in properly. So in order to fix this, I need to disconnect the power, go inside of the PC again and take out the SATA cable and make sure it is plugged in properly into the SATA port. As you can see, it is done. Now I have switched on the PC again and I can see it is fully loaded now into Windows. I hope you have enjoyed this demonstration of me disassembling a PC, looking at the components, and then reassembling the PC again. Thank you.